In the summer of 1943, as World War II entered its fourth year, Europe was engulfed in flames. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet Red Army was struggling to stand after 2 relentless years of defense, having sacrificed millions of soldiers but still managing to hold Moscow, Leningrad, and now Stalingrad. In North Africa, the German-Italian forces had been defeated and driven out of the desert. In the Atlantic, the once terrifying U-boat menace was now restrained by radar, sonar, and Allied long-range air power. Yet despite these losses, the Nazi war machine continued to operate, and the deep reason lay in the flow of oil from Romania, a land rich in resources that had become the lifeblood of the Third Reich. The city of Ploiești, about 60 kilometers north of Bucharest, had long been called the oil capital of Europe. Its oil fields were not only abundant, but also supported by an advanced network of refineries, storage facilities, pipelines, railways, and modern transport ports established even before the war. When Nazi Germany extended its influence into the Balkans, Romania, first under King Carol II and later under Ion Antonescu's military dictatorship, quickly became both an ally and a strategic supplier. For Hitler, no resource was more precious than Ploiești, as it provided roughly 30 to 40% of Germany's annual fuel needs. Every Panzer tank charging into the Russian steppes, every Messerschmitt soaring into the skies, every U-boat lurking in the Atlantic, all relied on the black barrels of oil refined in Ploiești. The Allied High Command recognized this early on. Even before the United States entered the war, the British had repeatedly stressed the need to neutralize Romania's refineries. But geography made it almost impossible. Bombers from Britain lacked the range. The Soviet Union was not an option since Germany still controlled Eastern Europe, and flights from the Middle East or North Africa would be far too long, stretching over thousands of kilometers of enemy territory. Only when the U.S. entered the Mediterranean theater and secured airfields in Libya after the Tunisian victory in early 1943 did the idea of a direct strike on Ploiești finally become feasible. Thus, Operation Tidal Wave was conceived. On paper, it was one of the boldest bombing missions of the entire war. Instead of the traditional high-altitude raids, often inaccurate and ineffective, the Americans chose a radically different tactic, flying extremely low, just a few hundred feet above the ground and striking the refineries like a devastating tidal wave. The reasoning was simple. Ploiești was protected by a dense network of heavy anti-aircraft guns. At high altitude, the B-24s would be easy prey for the flak. At very low altitude, however, they might achieve surprise, giving the defenders no time to swivel their guns or organize an effective defense. This decision meant B-24 Liberator crews would be forced to fly in a manner completely at odds with their aircraft's design. The Liberator was a heavy long-range bomber built to fly high, carry heavy bomb loads, and endure long missions. It was not suited for sharp dives, evasive maneuvers, or dangerous low-level flight where a single mistake could send the entire crew crashing into the ground. Nevertheless, U.S. commanders, particularly Major General Uzal Ent, commander of the 9th Air Force, convinced the leadership that this was the only way to achieve decisive results. If successful, Ploiești could be reduced to ashes in a single day, potentially shortening the war by years. The squadrons were carefully selected and gathered in Libya, at the dusty airfields around Benghazi. For weeks, B-24 crews trained in low-level flying across the desert, practicing tight turns close to the ground and memorizing every detail of Romania's terrain. The rehearsals were grueling. Many planes suffered damage from sandstorms, and many pilots realized that the bulky Liberator was far from ideal for such a mission. But orders were orders, and in the determined atmosphere of 1943, when the Allies longed for a decisive blow to the heart of the Reich, no one dared to shrink back. Meanwhile, the Germans and Romanians were far from idle. Their intelligence agencies had long known that Ploiești was an inevitable target. Since 1942, they had reinforced the defenses. Anti-aircraft guns were camouflaged around the refineries, hidden in civilian houses on rooftops, in church towers, even in haystacks scattered across fields. By mid-1943, more than 200 heavy flak guns and thousands of smaller machine guns were positioned around the city. In addition, the Luftwaffe and the Romanian Air Force maintained fighter squadrons at nearby airfields, ready to intercept attackers at a moment's notice. Ploiești had been transformed into a fortress of steel, daring any raid to challenge it. On August 1, 1943, the operation began. At dawn, 178 B-24 Liberators rumbled down the sandy runways of Libya, heavily loaded with bombs and carrying the hopes of the U.S. command. Many airmen knew this would be a mission of life or death, a 2,400-kilometer round trip over Greece, Yugoslavia, and the Balkans before reaching Romania. The sheer distance alone was daunting. If an engine failed, if they were badly hit, or if they strayed off course, survival was unlikely. But the orders were clear. Destroy Ploiești at all costs. As the silver wings of the Liberators disappeared into the Mediterranean sky, few of those men realized they were flying into one of the most brutal air battles in history, a tragedy that would forever be remembered as Black Sunday. When the steel wings of the B-24 Liberators lifted off from Benghazi on the morning of August 1, 1943, the skies over North Africa were still veiled in the pale mist of dawn. This was an operation without precedent, nearly 180 bombers flying more than 1,600 kilometers across the Mediterranean, over the Balkans, and toward the industrial heart of the Axis oil empire, the Romanian city of Ploiești. For the American pilots, this mission was not simply a long-distance flight. It was a life-or-death gamble. Either they would succeed and deliver a crippling blow to Germany's war machine, or they would fail and suffer losses on a scale never before seen. From the very start, difficulties emerged. A massive formation flying at low altitude required pilots to hold tight spacing for hours on end. They were almost wingtip to wingtip, where a single mistake could cause catastrophic collisions. The roar of hundreds of Pratt & Whitney engines merged into a thunderous storm of sound, shaking the air and leaving many crews breathless. Flying low helped them avoid German radar, but it also made them more visible to civilians, outposts, and, most dangerously, ground defenses. As they crossed the Adriatic Sea and the Balkan ranges, several groups encountered technical troubles. Some were forced to turn back, others strayed from formation. The first disaster struck when a Liberator malfunctioned and plunged into the sea, killing its entire crew. Such silent losses foreshadowed the brutal ordeal ahead. Approaching Romanian airspace, a critical mishap occurred. The lead navigation group lost its bearings. Errors in calculation and the difficulty of low-level navigation caused the formations to scatter. Instead of striking simultaneously, the bombers arrived in staggered waves, some even going off course and circling back, completely exposing the mission plan. The key element of surprise, the linchpin of the operation, was lost. Meanwhile, the Germans and Romanians were not caught off guard. In fact, they had long anticipated a major strike against Ploiești after earlier reconnaissance flights. Hundreds of anti-aircraft guns of all calibers were concealed throughout the city, many ingeniously camouflaged. Batteries were hidden inside church towers, on rooftops, and even within converted civilian homes. Fighter units of the Luftwaffe and the Romanian Air Force stood ready at nearby bases, prepared to pounce. The moment the Americans reached Ploiești's outskirts, the sky erupted. Barrages of flak shredded the air, thick black smoke rising over the city. Flying at only a few hundred feet, the Liberators had no choice but to plunge straight into the firestorm. Many were hit immediately, bursting into blazing fireballs that crashed into fields and neighborhoods below. Explosions thundered, and columns of smoke mingled with the burning refinery stacks. Some groups pressed into the industrial heart regardless. The sight of massive B-24s skimming past smokestacks, weaving between towering structures to drop their bombs, became a testament to sheer audacity. Pilots were forced to steer their huge aircraft through narrow urban corridors, where even a slight error would shear wings against buildings or pipelines. Accuracy under such conditions was nearly impossible, yet many crews still struck their targets. One such group was led by Colonel John R. Kane, commander of the 98th Bomb Group, whose calm and discipline stood out amid the chaos. Despite the withering defenses, he led his men straight into the Astra Romana refinery, one of the largest in Eastern Europe. Their bombs ignited massive fuel tanks, triggering chain explosions of staggering intensity. Flames and smoke soared hundreds of meters high, blanketing the skies above Ploiești. At the same time, tragedies unfolded. Lieutenant Colonel Addison Baker and pilot John Jerstad, flying a burning Liberator riddled with flak damage, refused to turn away. Instead, they held course and rammed into their target. Their aircraft exploded along with the entire crew, but their sacrifice threw the refinery complex into disarray, easing the path for later waves. Both men were posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, a testament to ultimate sacrifice. In the chaos, the surviving B-24s dropped their bombs and sought to escape, yet leaving Ploiești was no easier than entering. Flak still thundered, and enemy fighters tore into the battered formations. Dogfights erupted in the skies over Romania, where the lumbering Liberators struggled against the nimble Bf-109s and IAR-80s. Many damaged bombers became easy prey. Some crews were forced to crash land in fields only to be taken prisoner. After hours of bitter fighting, the survivors limped back toward Libya. The return journey was grueling. Crippled planes running out of fuel, damaged engines failing mid-flight, and exhausted crews straining to make it home. More than a few Liberators fell into the Mediterranean, within sight of safety. The final tally stunned Allied command. 53 bombers lost, nearly a third of the force. Over 660 airmen were killed, wounded, or captured. For the U.S. Army Air Forces, it was one of the costliest single missions of the war. Yet the larger question lingered: was the sacrifice worth it? In the short term, the raid inflicted serious damage on Ploiești's refineries, cutting production sharply for weeks. But the Germans and Romanians rapidly repaired the facilities. Within a short time, output was nearly restored. The mission failed to achieve its strategic goal of crippling Axis fuel supplies. Militarily, Operation Tidal Wave became a harsh lesson. It proved that low-level bombing against heavily fortified targets was close to suicidal. The courage of the American crews was undeniable, but the tactic was ill-suited to reality. After this disaster, U.S. air strategy shifted toward high-altitude bombing, paired with long-range escort fighters like the P-51 Mustang, a combination that would prove decisive in the war's later stages. The raid on Ploiești is remembered not only as the tragedy of Black Sunday, but also as a turning point that forced the Allies to rethink the power of air warfare. It stands as proof that boldness must be matched with sound strategy, or else bravery may be squandered for little gain. When the surviving B-24s gradually returned to their base in Benghazi on the night of August 1, 1943, the scene was devastating. On the runway, ground crews were stunned to see the battered Liberators limping home, fuselages riddled with flak holes, cockpit glass shattered, engines or landing gear missing. Some aircraft crash-landed on their bellies, trailing smoke, as exhausted crews crawled out. Entire squadrons came back with only a handful of planes from the dozens that had taken off. The air was devoid of triumph, replaced instead by heavy silence and a profound sense of loss. The U.S. Army Air Forces Command in North Africa quickly tallied the disaster. 53 aircraft shot down or missing, over 660 airmen killed, wounded, or captured. This was the highest casualty rate ever suffered in a single mission. In reality, the losses were even greater if one counted the heavily damaged planes that could never fly again. American commanders admitted that, although several refineries at Ploiești had been severely hit, the mission had failed strategically. In the days following the raid, Ploiești still burned. Huge storage tanks had exploded, pipelines were shattered, and vast sections of the refineries lay in ruins. Photographs captured Romanian workers and German engineers battling flames, struggling to salvage infrastructure, grim evidence of the brutality of Black Sunday. Axis leadership initially feared the worst, since Ploiești was the lifeblood of their war machine. Astonishingly, within weeks, oil production had nearly recovered. Nazi Germany and Romania launched an emergency repair system of remarkable efficiency. Engineers, laborers, and prisoners were pressed into round-the-clock work, swiftly replacing damaged equipment with pre-stocked reserves. Some facilities completely leveled were rebuilt within mere months. This revealed an uncomfortable truth. Ploiești could not be eliminated in a single strike. Its strategic importance ensured that the Axis prioritized its defense and rapid reconstruction. In fact, since 1942, German planners had anticipated Allied attacks on the oil fields and prepared countermeasures. Thus, despite the raid's damage, Ploiești continued to supply oil to the Wehrmacht for another year. For the Allies, the failure was a shock. The low-level bombing tactic, expected to deliver surprise, proved disastrous. Flying at just a few hundred feet placed the bombers in the deadliest range of flak and anti-aircraft fire. The benefit of avoiding radar was far outweighed by the risk of being shot down point-blank. Moreover, navigating at low altitude over thousands of kilometers was too complex and error-prone. The navigational errors that scattered lead groups critically undermined the mission's cohesion. From this bloody lesson, U.S. air strategy shifted. Rather than low-level strikes, they turned to high-altitude bombing, protected by long-range fighter escorts. The arrival of the P-51 Mustang in late 1943 transformed the air war. With speed, range, and maneuverability, the Mustang allowed bombers to penetrate deep into German territory while remaining under protection. Thanks to this shift, subsequent campaigns, particularly Operation Point Blank, aimed at Germany's industrial heart, finally achieved decisive results, crippling the Luftwaffe and Hitler's war economy. Though Operation Tidal Wave failed, the sacrifice of the American crews was not in vain. The raid exposed flaws in Allied operational thinking and forced strategic change. At the same time, it left a powerful legacy of courage. The bravery of airmen who pressed into the inferno despite overwhelming defenses became a lasting symbol of sacrifice. 5 medals of honor were awarded for this mission, an unparalleled number for a single operation, reflecting the extraordinary heroism displayed. For Romanian civilians, the raid brought harsh tragedy. Though the refineries were the intended targets, low-level bombing and smoke-filled chaos meant surrounding neighborhoods were also struck. Hundreds of civilians were killed, thousands left homeless. Later, U.S. reports acknowledged civilian losses as unavoidable, but the scars remained deep in Romanian memory. Throughout 1944, Ploiești continued to endure heavy bombing, this time from high-altitude raids with far greater force. Only by mid-1944, as the Red Army advanced into Romania, did the Axis finally lose control of the vital oil fields. Thus, while Operation Tidal Wave failed to end Ploiești's role outright, it marked the beginning of a relentless Allied campaign against Axis oil supplies. In the history of air warfare, Operation Tidal Wave stands as one of the boldest yet most tragic missions. It illustrates the razor-thin line between bravery and strategic recklessness. Military historians often argue that the same resources, applied to a coordinated high-altitude effort, might have achieved far more. Yet, in 1943, with limited experience and without effective long-range escort technology, the decision reflected a necessary tactical experiment. Today, Operation Tidal Wave is remembered for 2 enduring aspects. First, the epic courage of U.S. airmen. Knowing the dangers, they charged straight into the fire, leaving behind tales of heroism retold for generations. Second, its strategic lesson. Air power cannot win through boldness alone. It requires coordination, preparation, and the right technology. From painful defeats like Ploiești, the U.S. Air Force matured. Within a year, it had become a colossal war machine, dominating Europe's skies. In that sense, the bloodshed by the fallen crews over Romania helped pave the path to final Allied victory in World War II. After World War II ended, the sounds of explosions and the smoke over Ploiești gradually faded into history. Yet the memory of Operation Tidal Wave, one of the boldest and bloodiest bombing missions in the history of the U.S. Air Force, remained significant, serving both as a symbol of courage and as a bitter lesson in military strategy. In Romania, the city of Ploiești bore the scars of war for decades. The refineries, targets of hundreds of tons of bombs, were not only devastated in 1943, but also repeatedly struck by high-altitude U.S. bombing raids in 1944. Surrounding neighborhoods, located dangerously close to the industrial complexes, also suffered heavily. Many families lost loved ones, and thousands of civilians were left homeless. For Romanians, Ploiești became more than just an industrial hub. It was a symbol of the sacrifice of innocent civilians caught in the whirlwind of global war. After 1945, as Romania fell under Soviet influence, the memory of the Ploiești raids was reframed through a political lens. In textbooks and official media, American bombers were often depicted as invaders, bringing death and destruction to the country. The suffering of civilians was emphasized, while the strategic context, the American attempt to cripple Hitler's oil lifeline, was obscured. As a result, generations of Romanians viewed the mission negatively until after the Cold War, when access to Western archives allowed for a more balanced perspective. Across the Atlantic, in the United States, Operation Tidal Wave was quickly enshrined in Air Force tradition. As early as 1943, official reports acknowledged its strategic failure, yet simultaneously honored the valor of the airmen involved. The awarding of 5 Medals of Honor, the highest number ever given for a single mission, elevated the battle into legend within the U.S. Air Force. Dozens of Distinguished Service Crosses and other decorations were also presented. For the surviving veterans, Ploiești remained an unforgettable wound. They recalled the inferno that engulfed the city, comrades falling into clouds of smoke, and the helplessness of watching fellow aviators perish. Many said they had never endured a mission so brutal, flying at treetop level through a storm of flak and gunfire just meters above the ground, seeing every cannon and machine gun firing directly at them. Those memories haunted them for life, living proof of the ferocity of air warfare. Military historians often view Operation Tidal Wave as a turning point in U.S. strategic thinking. Before 1943, many in the Air Force believed low-level raids could deliver accuracy and surprise. Ploiești proved otherwise. Against dense, well-prepared defenses, such tactics led to catastrophic losses. Afterward, the U.S. virtually abandoned large-scale low-altitude strikes on major targets. Instead, they focused on daylight high-altitude bombing with long-range fighter escorts, most notably the combination of B-17 Flying Fortresses, B-24 Liberators, and P-51 Mustangs in the war's final phase. Another lesson was the importance of intelligence and navigation. One of the raid's key failures stemmed from navigational errors. Bomber groups lost formation, the element of surprise collapsed, and the mission unraveled. In response, the Allies placed greater emphasis on aerial reconnaissance, secure communications, and improved navigation technology, enhancements that made later campaigns in 1944-1945 far more effective. In modern military academies, Operation Tidal Wave is often cited as a textbook case of tactical success but strategic failure. Although several refineries were destroyed in the short term, the long-term impact was minimal, while American losses were staggering. The mission showed that not all bold actions produce results, and that soldiers' bravery sometimes paid the price for unworkable strategic choices. Beyond the military perspective, Operation Tidal Wave left a cultural legacy. Many U.S. veterans' memoirs describe it as a nightmarish experience. American documentaries of the 1950s-1970s reconstructed Black Sunday with images of B-24s skimming smokestacks and releasing bombs amid relentless fire. These depictions honored courage, but also served as a stark reminder of war's enormous costs. After the Cold War, as U.S.-Romanian relations improved, the mission began to be studied from both perspectives. Romanian historians increasingly acknowledged that while civilian losses were tragic, the raids were part of the global struggle to defeat Nazi Germany. Joint commemorations were held, where American veterans and Romanian citizens came together to remember the lives lost, soldiers and civilians alike. It was a late but meaningful act of reconciliation between former adversaries. Today, in the United States, many aviation museums display artifacts and photographs from Operation Tidal Wave. Air Force academies teach it as a milestone in the evolution of modern air doctrine. In Romania, war museums in Ploiești preserve records that show the scale of devastation the city endured. Memorials to civilians killed in the bombings stand as solemn reminders to future generations of the price of war. Viewed as a whole, Operation Tidal Wave transcended its status as a failed mission. It became a dual symbol. On one side, the tragedy of thousands of lost lives. On the other, a milestone in the U.S. Air Force's maturation. From its painful lessons, America reshaped its air strategy, contributing decisively to the ultimate Allied victory. Perhaps the greatest legacy of Operation Tidal Wave does not lie in the number of bombs dropped or refineries destroyed, but in collective memory. It is the memory of airmen who faced an almost impossible task with courage, of the innocent people of Ploiești who bore the consequences, and of the terrible price humanity pays in global war. That memory helped forge the post-1945 longing for peace, the hope that no city, no nation would ever endure another Black Sunday. When the smoke and fire gradually cleared over Ploiești, the surviving B-24s broke out of the inferno, desperately seeking their way back to base in Libya. On the long return journey of more than 1,600 kilometers, many bombers were heavily damaged, plagued by engine trouble or running dangerously low on fuel. Quite a few pilots were forced to make emergency landings in neutral Turkey, where they were interned until the end of the war. Others never returned at all, crashing into the Mediterranean or across the Balkans. In total, out of 178 aircraft that had taken off, only about 110 made it back to Benghazi. 53 were lost completely, nearly one-third of the initial force. Casualties were staggering. Around 660 American airmen were killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. It was one of the heaviest losses ever suffered by the U.S. Army Air Forces in a single bombing mission during World War II. Yet in terms of strategic effect, the outcome did not match the sacrifice. Several refineries at Ploiești were destroyed or severely damaged, but the German-Romanian oil complex proved remarkably resilient. Within just a few weeks, through urgent repairs and abundant manpower, the Germans restored most of the capacity. In fact, crude oil output soon surpassed pre-raid levels thanks to simultaneous upgrades during reconstruction. This meant that, although Operation Tidal Wave struck a fierce blow, it failed to cripple the Nazi regime's vital fuel supply. For the Americans, the raid was a sobering shock. The low-level bombing strategy, once expected to deliver decisive surprise, revealed itself as lethally dangerous against a fortified and well-prepared defense network. U.S. military planners realized that instead of daring knockout punches, the war in the air required long-term systematic campaigns, supported by long-range fighter escorts. After Ploiești, the U.S. Air Force gradually shifted its doctrine, favoring high-altitude bombing coordinated with escort fighters like the P-51 Mustang, enabling deeper strikes into German territory with far fewer losses. Although a strategic failure, Operation Tidal Wave left behind a powerful legacy of courage and sacrifice. 5 Medals of Honor were awarded during this single mission, the highest ever for one air raid. Figures such as Lieutenant Cole Addison Baker, Captain John Jerstad, and Col John R. Kane became enduring symbols of valor and self-sacrifice. In American military history, the battle came to be known as Black Sunday, both to honor those who fell and as a grim reminder of the price of flawed strategic calculation. The Ploiești raid of 1943 was not only a tragic chapter for the U.S. Air Force, but also a turning point in the understanding of modern air warfare. It proved that German industrial power could not be shattered by a single strike, and that modern war demanded persistence, coordination, and superior technology. From that failure, the Americans drew crucial lessons to refine their strategy, preparing for the devastating bombing campaigns against Germany's industrial heartlands from 1944 onward, operations that finally helped break Hitler's war machine. Operation Tidal Wave, though falling short of its intended goals, remains remembered as one of World War II's boldest and bloodiest air raids, etched into history as both a testament to sacrifice and a stark illustration of the limits of air power.